goes without saying that we all know what it is like to wait. Right? We know the shape and the contours of waiting. We know the actual weight of waiting, how it feels in our bodies and holds us down. We know its texture and even its taste, if you think about it. Because we spend a good part of our lives waiting on something or someone. And as we'll hear over the coming weeks when we light the Advent candles, there are lots of things that we are able and we are willing to wait for. The light to change, the coffee to brew, our turn to come, the service to start, or the service to end, depending on your perspective. And I don't know who came up with this or how they came up with this figure, but one time study, one person estimated that during an average lifespan, a person ends up spending, does anyone want to guess how long we spend waiting in our lives? You probably don't want to, right? 5 years. If you put together all the times that we wait, 5 years of the average lifespan is spent waiting. And that includes 6 months of waiting at red lights. Again, I don't know how they came up with this figure. It could be just, stuff that's made up on the internet. But it kind of feels true, right? When you're waiting, it feels like forever. So because we spend all of this time waiting, it is fitting for us to actually take time to consider what it means to wait. To examine what we do with this seemingly empty and yet full space that we have when we're forced to wait. See, Advent is this liturgical season of waiting. And this liturgical season of waiting is a fancy way of saying that it is a specific time the church has set aside to practice waiting. In Advent, we practice what it means to wait. Just like in sports or music or any other area that requires practice, it's about building muscle memory. Right? Now, how many of you have ever seen the original Karate Kid movie? Okay, good. So this won't be lost on you. All right. So this is the analogy that I have. The liturgical seasons are similar to how Mr. Miyagi had Daniel paint the fence and then wax the car, right? Do you remember why he did that? What was the purpose of painting the fence and then waxing the car? By having Daniel do this same motion over and over again, Mr. Miyagi was building up Daniel's muscle memory so that he had it in him when it actually came time to train to fight. Right? The wisdom of Mr. Miyagi is the liturgical seasons. That is how they work. During Christmas, the season of Christmas, we practice receiving God's gift of grace. During Epiphany, we practice discovering God's ongoing revelation. During Lent, we practice asking forgiveness. During Easter, we practice living into the resurrection. And during the ordinary time after Pentecost, we practice what it means to live as Christ's disciples every day. Did you know that you were doing this much practicing? Right? In Advent, these 4 weeks of Advent, we practice waiting. So that when we find ourselves in one of those seemingly empty in-between moments, we have the muscle memory to know what to do with that time. Without that muscle memory, we end up waiting in lots of different ways. We can become frustrated or bored. We can anxiously wring our hands, or we can complacently just shrug our shoulders. We can roll our eyes to play it down, or let our worst fears build it up. There's lots of ways that we end up waiting when we haven't built up that muscle memory. But in Advent, we practice what it means to wait with expectancy, knowing that Christ has come into the world and will come again. We practice tuning our attention from what is to what will be. Now, traditionally, each Sunday in Advent focuses our attention on both how we're to wait for the coming of Christ, as well as what the coming of Christ means for us and for the world at large. And those are represented by the 4 candles that we will light, one each Sunday. The candle we lit today is the one of hope. Very good. Very good. Next week, we will light the candle of peace, and then the candle of joy, and then finally love. These are the things that we are to practice as we wait. And they're also the lessons that will come from our waiting. How to hold on to hope, how to promote peace, how to inhabit joy, and how to rest in love. As we've already said, there's lots of things that we're willing to wait for. But these things, hope, peace, joy, love, they are the things that cannot wait. They are what enable us to wait, and they are what enable us to work for the change that is coming. Because you see, waiting is about the anticipation of change. It's about preparing for what is coming. It's about dreaming about a future that is yet to be, a future that is always unfolding. It's about what was, becoming what is, and what is giving way to what will be. But how we wait, how we dream, and how we prepare for this future that is always unfolding makes a difference to how we live in this present moment. It makes the difference between whether we wait with frustration and boredom or whether we wait with expectancy and hope. This morning we heard the words of Isaiah, another one of the major prophets, speaking to a people who are living in uncertain times. People who are subject to the whims and wishes of military regimes and political systems that are beyond their control. And this is what Isaiah, son of Amoz, saw, which is an interesting verb to use here because usually a prophecy given to a prophet is a word given by God, something that is heard by the prophet and then told to the people. But here Isaiah is very clear that this is what he saw. This is what he saw, the word of God concerning Judah and Jerusalem. Here the prophet was given a vision of a radically different ending to the story the people were currently living. See, Isaiah could see beyond the imminent devastation and destruction the people faced and saw a different future. One in which all nations stream to God's holy mountain, where they're hungry for God's instruction, and they are obedient to God's judgment that swords should be turned into plowshares and spears into pruning hooks. And this is the power of hope. This is what we celebrate and we remember and we focus on this morning. How hope glimmers around the edges of how the world appears, and how it casts a vision of what is possible, of how the world can be. See, hope runs deeper than vague optimism, and it outpaces common sense. This sacred hope that we hold is sturdier than a cheery platitude, and it's more powerful than a handy life hack. Hope is the power to see the world through God's eyes, as God desires it to be. It's the invitation to behold the world in a different light and the courage to declare that that world is possible, despite all the evidence to the contrary, that this world is possible. Hope enables us to keep going. It is the power to resist and defy what is in the light of what can and will be. And above all, hope is God's deep and abiding presence with us, no matter what. Isaiah's vision that we're given begins with the prophet seeing the mountain of God's temple rising above all the other hills and people from all nations streaming towards it. Now it's interesting, and it's worth noting here that the Hebrew word translated here as stream actually has two meanings. The first is pretty self-explanatory. It means to flow like water, which is why it's translated here as stream. It's a description of movement. The people are moving towards God's holy mountain as a stream. They're flowing to it. But the second description is also fitting and also refers to a characteristic of flowing water, though it's more a description about appearance than movement. And to understand this definition, I want you to picture a river. All right? Everyone have a river in their mind? All right. Now I want you to picture that river on a sunny day. Picture how the sunlight dances and sparkles off the surface, almost with an inherent joy. That is what the prophet is describing. The verb describing how the people are streaming to God's mountain also means to shine in joyful radiance. This is how the people are making their way to God's holy mountain. This is the portrait of hope that we hold up today. People from every nation shining with joyful radiance as they come together on this journey to God's holy mountain. People from every nation who've known the pain of broken systems and the empty promises of politicians making their way to receive God's instruction and judgments. People from every nation who have been pushed to the margins, who have known the pain of hunger and the sting of death, making their way to God's holy mountain where they will lay down their weapons of war and fight no more. This is the vision of Isaiah. This is the sacred hope that we hold. So here we have the power of hope that casts a vision of a radical new reality and a portrait of hope that brings people together from all nations. And now we are left to consider the practice of hope. If this season of Advent is indeed about practicing what it means to wait, then we should consider what it means to practice hope. With this in mind, Isaiah's words reveal to us how we can best practice hope as we wait for Christ to be born anew again in us and the world. First, we can practice seeing the world as God desires it to be. This means paying attention. It means sharpening our focus on the glimmer of hope that shimmers around the edge of how things are and reveals to us what can be. Practicing hope also means sharing this vision with others and helping them to see what's possible in the midst of a present reality that seems unbearable and interminable. Holding on to God's promise of what will be and letting God's promise hold us in hard times keeps our hope alive and gives us the strength to keep going, to keep climbing until we reach that mountaintop and can celebrate with all of those companions on the journey with us. The second way that we can practice hope is by orienting ourselves towards God's holy dwelling place. People stream towards God's holy mountain. They were oriented to where God was. There is no shortage of things that clamor for our attention. Last week we talked about how lots of people and things promise us quick fixes and easy solutions to our problems, but how all these things and people would lead us astray for their own gain. It takes practice to attune our hearts and our ears to where God is at work, to hear that still small voice crying out to us from the wilderness. We have to practice orienting ourselves to God's holy mountain. In Isaiah, we hear how he wrote how the mountain of God's temple would be established as the most important mountain and would be raised above all others, which is an interesting projection considering that the Temple Mount that Isaiah was talking about is really more of a hill than a mountain, and it isn't even the most prominent in the area. There's other larger hills around it. But what I think Isaiah is saying that is, if it is our focus, if we practice bringing God's voice and presence into greater focus in our lives, then certain things become more prominent to us. Like zooming in on a target, everything else blurs into the background and we can focus on that which gives us life. You see, in Isaiah's vision, it is the people's desire to know God's instruction and to receive God's judgment that bring them into focus. It's the people's desire, rather than God's or anyone else's dictates, that prompts the people to stream to God's mountain. It's about cultivating that desire for the things of God. And finally, in the people's response to God's judgment, we are given one of the most striking images of what it means to live as God's people in the world today. An image that begins to bring next week's theme of peace into focus. In response to God's instruction and judgments, the people will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Isaiah tells us that one nation will not raise the sword against another, and never again will they train for war. Never again will they train for war. What a blessed hope that is. This is the sacred hope that we hold. This is what we are called to practice. A hope for a future of peace, where never again will we train for war. Beloved of God, this sacred hope can't wait. In this season of Advent, I pray that it pricks your heart and it fills your soul with the glimmer of what can be when we are willing to work and come together and lay our weapons down. In this season of waiting, may we practice taking a breath. In a world that groans for change, may we hold on to hope and sow seeds of peace. And through it all, through our waiting and our practicing, may the hope of Christ's coming empower you to wait with grace and courage. May it be so.